Did the blind man hear what the disciples said when they were talking about him to Jesus? You know, they say that if someone loses one of their senses, the remaining senses become sharper and more sensitive to compensate. And so I kind of imagine his hearing was pretty good, right? So he must have heard when they said, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" It was a question about him. But of course, they did not have the nerve to speak to him directly. And I've always found that much more wounding, right? To overhear someone say something bad about you behind your back. Wouldn't you prefer they just say it to your face? And note that the question didn't even have anything to do with anything under his control. They did not raise concerns because he blocked their way on the sidewalk or had dared to ask them if they had any spare change. No. Their question was provoked by his mere existence. Why did he have to exist with his disability? And it was actually not even a why question, because they were not asking Jesus why the man was blind. They knew why he was blind. He was blind because somebody had sinned. That was obvious to them. Somebody had done something that meant that this man deserved to spend his life never seeing the light of day, or the beauty of a sunset, or the smile on a loved one's face. Well, they were certain. The only question in their mind was, who had sinned and made it so that the affliction was deserved? And they had actually narrowed down their suspect list to 2. I'm sure he heard them. I'm sure he understood the assumptions that they were making because, well, they were hardly the first to do so. He had heard exactly this kind of question before, all the time. He'd heard this kind of question so often that there were days that he wished his hearing wasn't so good. How do I know that he heard it all the time? I mean, I'm not blind. I do not suffer from any visible disability. I'm not even sure you could call my hearing excellent. It's not as good as it used to be. But even I have heard enough people making those kinds of assumptions to know that he was surrounded by them every day, constantly. Now, today, of course, we don't really hear people using the same kind of religious language that the disciples use. We don't hear people speculating literally about who sinned. But I do know that when people see a tragedy, whether it is a disability or a trauma or an injustice, they do jump to questions that essentially mean the same thing. I mean, you hear it, right? A woman is assaulted or maybe raped. What do people ask? Well, what was she wearing? Or what was she doing there? Are they not asking who sinned that this terrible thing happened? And are they not implying, at least in part, that it was the victim who sinned? And once you realize that that's what the question is, you begin to hear that question everywhere. We've heard it many times already this year. Why didn't she move her car forward? Why did he bring a legally permitted and licensed handgun to a protest? Why did the people, the children of Gaza, elect Hamas as government before they even were born? Why did these schoolgirls in Iran live under dictatorship for so long? We ask questions that assume that the victims must be to blame. The same assumptions are often brought to discussions about social issues like poverty or lack of shelter. Because you know what? It's easier to talk about such problems in terms of the faults or the shortcomings of the poor than it is to talk about structural issues in society that may perpetuate such problems. We don't ask who is profiting from the crisis or why wealth has moved upwards so radically over the last few decades. No, we ask questions that assume that the poor are lazy or lacking in initiative. Who sinned? Well, surely not the rich. It must have been the poor who sinned. Such questions are, of course, often hurtful because they send a message to the person who has suffered a tragedy that they deserve. They deserve this terrible thing that happened to them. It's an additional attack against someone who's already been wounded. And such hurtful questions center about things that are often beyond their control, as in the case of the blind man. It's also a way of denying somebody their dignity because they have suffered. I mean, take the blind man, for example. The disciples' question reduced his existence to nothing more than his ability. His existence, his mere existence, was in their eyes a tragedy. Are they not suggesting that the world would be a better place, or at least a less troubling place, if he did not exist? When all you see is someone's disability, you miss all of the things that make them a rich and full person. I mean, this blind man had an inner life. He had thoughts and feelings and passions. He had people that he loved and people who loved him. To reduce him to this moral problem stripped him of his value as a human being. Now, I got to say that I don't think that we do this because we are trying to be cruel. We do it because we're afraid. We see sickness and tragedy and disability and terrible things, and we come to terms with this simple truth that, yes, terrible things happen in this world. They happen all the time. And when you see that, it reminds you that, terrible things could happen to you or to the people you love. That's frightening. And so people need to reassure themselves that they're safe, that tragedy is not arbitrary. And so it makes the world seem safer if there is some moral logic to tragedy. So blaming the victim, figuring out who sinned so that the tragedy is deserved, gives people that feeling of safety. If bad things happen because people sin, well, then I can be safe. If I don't sin, that's at least something under my control. Now, obviously, that feeling of safety is false. It is based on a lie, but people have been comforting themselves with lies since forever. So the blind man heard the question. What's more, he had heard that question over and over again, formulated in various ways, so often that I don't doubt that he had internalized the question. I mean, he too spent too much time wondering what he had done to deserve the darkness that he lived in. To the extent that he had internalized that, the darkness had spread in him. It had spread beyond his eyes to affect his soul. But that was about to change in dramatic fashion. Yeah, the man heard the disciples' questions, but that means he could surely hear Jesus' response. And if the disciples' question was more of what he heard all the time, well, he surely perked up his ears at what Jesus said, because it was different. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, Jesus said. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. And I actually don't want to go any further in our reading today. I know that Jesus' opening words are overshadowed by what happens next. I mean, the story after that becomes this incredible miracle story. Everyone loves a good miracle story. And this one has great, memorable details. Who can forget the image of Jesus playing in the mud made with his own spit? It is a callback, by the way, to the story of God shaping Adam in the book of Genesis from the mud. It is a hands-on image of Jesus' healing ministry, literally hands-on. And of course, the miracle is also a parable for the key point of this chapter, that Jesus has come to be the light of the world. And of course, we can rejoice at the light that came into that blind man's life, not just his eyes, mind you, but into his entire soul. But before we move on, I think we need to talk about the healing that Jesus performed before he knelt down and started playing in the dirt. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, Jesus said. And with those few words, he tore apart the message that this man had heard all of his life. His disability, Jesus was saying, was not deserved. His blindness, not a curse. And what's more, he was more than his disability. And that's not just a message for that man. It is a message for all of us. And yeah, part of the message is that, terrible things happen in this world, and we may never know why. That is a hard and frightening truth. But we do ourselves no favors by refusing to face up to that truth. Even more important, Jesus is telling us that this common reflex we have of blaming the victims for their tragedies is not only wrong and cruel, it is as destructive to ourselves as it is to the victims. And that becomes plain as Jesus continues. He was born blind, he goes on, so that God's works might be revealed in him. And this part of what Jesus says is a little bit trickier, because I think sometimes we misunderstand it. Sometimes, you see, this is taken to mean that, well, if you have suffered, it is because God has willfully afflicted you in order to bring something good out of it. I don't accept that. I don't think that's right. The God that I have come to know through Jesus does not willingly afflict anyone. God weeps at anyone's suffering. That's the God revealed to us through the crucified Christ. No. Jesus is saying, tragedy may happen. You may never know why. I mean, perhaps God knows, but if God knows, I doubt we really have the capacity to understand such godly reasoning. But because of that, I would strongly encourage you, when you're struggling with some tragedy, do not cause yourself any more pain by agonizing over that question of why God let it happen to you, or what you're supposed to do to bring good out of it. I mean, if you've been hurt, you've been hurt. I will not pile on top of that the obligation that you have to figure out why. I will not ask you to manufacture some positive spin on it. Tragedy is tragedy. And whatever you feel about it is natural. Your human reaction is okay. There's nothing wrong with it. But if Jesus is not saying that God willfully afflicts us with terrible experiences, what is he saying? Well, he's looking at this blind man and not defining him by his disability. Jesus is looking at him and seeing him as a human being who has value and worth, who is a child of God. In other words, it doesn't matter what you may have suffered. It doesn't matter what lack others may see in you or what shortcomings you may see in yourself. Jesus is saying that God's works can be revealed in you. And yes, I'm aware that God's works were revealed in that particular blind man through the healing of what was wrong with his eyes. But if you think that's the only way it was revealed, you're not reading this story right. Yes, God's works were revealed in him in the light that came into his soul, not just his eyes. God's works were revealed in the testimony this man went on to give to his community. God's works were shown in the wisdom and the courage he demonstrated while doing so. And the potential for all of these things were already in this man long before Jesus came along and put mud on his eyes. He already had the potential to reveal God's works before Jesus came along. That's what Jesus is saying. And I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind because, you will not always obtain the healing that you ask for, the healing that you crave. Jesus never promises specific healings. But whatever may happen, we all have within us that same potential that Jesus saw in the blind man. That's why Jesus goes on to say, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. And as I said, I'm sure that the blind man had great hearing. So he heard that too. And that hearing of that had so much to do with how God was revealed in that man. God's works were revealed in that man, as much as the application of the mud to his eyes. And all of this, I guess, leaves us with one question. The blind man heard what Jesus said. What about you? What about you? Do you hear what Jesus is saying in this? And what are you going to do about it? How will God's works be revealed in you? Because Jesus is saying that they absolutely can be. Thanks be to the healing God, the loving God, the God who sees all of us. Thanks be to the God revealed to us in Christ Jesus. Amen.